WNYC-TV presents Barbaralee Diamonstein and...
Hi, I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein, and our guest today is Jamake Highwater, a Native American Indian who bridges the gap, lives in the space between Western and non-Western lifestyles. I guess you do that all the while you try to preserve Native American culture, as you have in one of your books, Song from the Earth. And on the other hand, you live so deeply in Western culture as the music editor of the Soho News.
Right.
In both of your incarnations, a very warm welcome to you, Jamake.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara.
You've been on a crusade for some time now to make Indian art more visible and more accessible.
That's true.
How do you propose to do that, and with what success have you met?
Well, I mean, I'm doing it in the only way that I know how, by writing about it, since I'm a writer, and who's Indian, and by talking about it, by lecturing and doing things like what we're doing here today. I guess it's hard for me to appraise the success of it, but my books, you know, have done well, and they've been picked up by what's nicest to me is that they're used by Native American studies programs in universities across the country. There are almost 100 universities that now have Native American studies programs.
I really meant something beyond really your books and
please.
your work, but the Indian art itself that you are so committed to and so concerned with.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has gained a larger audience and greater acceptability as an art form?
Not in the very closed art world that has its own sort of perception and its own notion of where it's coming from and where it's going. Not in the way, say, that African art has made a very strong impact. Most artists I know have an African piece or two and so on, admire it. But in New York, I always tell the story that in the Southwest, people always say to an Indian, gee, what tribe are you from? And in California, people always say, gee, you're an Indian, aren't you? And in New York, people always say, you're not an Indian, are you? And
what does that mean?
that means that
regional differences in taste?
I think regionally, we simply are invisible in New York City. I think many New Yorkers sort of think that an Indian almost has to be a put-on, that we're a terminal people, that after all, we don't exist anymore, or we exist somewhere on the roadside.
Maybe there's a more positive aspect of that New Yorkers think that there's a place for everyone in New York.
Well, I think that's more generous than I would be about it. I really think, in talking with other Native Americans about this, that we really don't have visibility in this city, which is the capital of media, and that concerns me. And I can tell you this because many of us, from the artist and friend Fritz Scholder, my own work, R.C. Gorman's work, I could go on and on. And it's really difficult for our publishers, our representatives, depending on what we do. It was more difficult. It's getting a little easier. It was very difficult to get us on television shows, to get us interviews. Once you got west of Chicago, they fell all over themselves.
Well, how do you explain that?
Because Indians simply are not visible. They are not
too remote from the New York experience.
The New York experience.
How many Indians are there in New York State?
Perhaps about 10,000.
Let's do something semantic for
Sure.
a moment. In our several minutes of conversation, we have both used interchangeably the terms Indians and Native Americans.
Right. Well, they're both wrong, Barbaralee. You realize that America is the name of a very nice Italian gentleman who just, and Indians are a reference to a people who live on the other side of the globe. Columbus didn't know where he was. We did, and it isn't what we call ourselves. And so though some of the more militant Indians today are concerned with what we are to be called, as women are concerned with that idea, and blacks have been concerned with it, and I think it's an important consideration. For me, whether
Which
we're called...
preference do you prefer?
I don't
Which
have a preference.
reference
I
do you
really don't
prefer?
have a preference. As a writer, I try to find as many synonyms for the word as possible, since I use it a great deal. And
How did you become a spokesman for Native Americans?
I don't know that I am a spokesperson for I have a feeling that I simply, that I speak for myself, just as you probably feel that you really express your own ideas and feelings about the art world. I too am not appointed nor feel assigned. I am certainly not the Henry Kissinger of Indians. On the other hand, there are some of us, few of us, who, because of the fact that we sort of broke certain taboos and made certain efforts that were unusual at the time, went ahead and into the Anglo, as we refer to the white world, the Anglo world of education and so on, and became a little bit more articulate in both cultures, and therefore felt the need to say something about our people to the world at large. We're separatists.
I think what I'm really thinking of is, when I said to you earlier, what is the perception of other Native Americans to you in your work? Your reference to the term taboos, I was really thinking in terms of Indian philosophy, and as contrasted to the Western, the Anglo sense of achievement. Is that in conflict?
Not anymore. It used to be. The main conflict that existed was that when my generation, even the prior generation, when the Scott Momaday generation, and it goes even further back to people like Charles Eastman at the turn of the century, but when people went off to the university, it was essentially to be assimilated. It was essentially to pass. And our people became very concerned about this, because it meant that they were literally seeing us disappear into the other culture. So that getting an education, therefore, wasn't considered an advantage. It was considered tribally a disadvantage. Also, I think it's terribly important to indicate that Indians have their own education, you see. You don't have to go to a university. I mean, as I've often said, when I was graduated, I'm told by the scholarship fund that's located in, headquartered in San Francisco, I was told by them, by their prior director, Dean Chavers, that I was one of 40 PhDs who were Indian. And some people always say, oh, isn't that terrible, isn't that sad? And I always say, well, not really. I mean, after all, how many Anglos have ever spent 4 years at a reservation becoming a holy man, you know, or a holy person? We have our own educational process, but there are some of us, and there are increasing numbers, who are interested in the educational institutions of the other world, of the Anglo world. And so as Japanese people will come here, or Japanese Americans will go into universities, that doesn't mean that they don't, within their own nation, within their own country or their own culture, have an educational process too. And I think that's terribly important. People always think that Indians, if they don't go to the university, somehow are ignorant, somehow are illiterate.
But it's really an Anglo standard as to the,
of course.
The value of education in general, not restricted to helping Indians, but helping everybody.
Right. Well, I speak out of the Indian experience, so, and
you
of course
yourself
it's a metaphor of a larger idea.
Blackfeet.
Yes, yes.
Blackfeet Cherokee parentage.
That's right.
You were born in Montana.
That's right.
Lived in California.
Part of my life, yes.
Now spend part of your life in New York.
That's
in
right.
Zurich.
That's
in
right.
Turkey. You are the most mobile of any.
Well, I come from a nomadic people, so that explains it.
In any case, while you were in New York, that you have been appointed to be the consultant to the New York State Council on the Arts. I assume for Indian affairs.
Essentially, yes.
What do you do in that capacity?
I visit various cultural programs concerned with Native Americans. There's a very large population, as we said, 10,000 or more.
Northern New York State?
Well, and in Manhattan, too. There's an American Indian community house right here on East 38th Street off Fifth Avenue, which has its own gallery and
You should tell them the address. It's 10 East 38th
No,
Street?
that's right, number 10, East 38th Street, you're right. And it has a gallery on the ground floor that's very effective and so on. And for a while, I was the president of the Cultural Council of that organization. And I'm very enthused by their work. But I also go upstate to St. Regis and the other reservations and other communities, because there are many Indian communities that are not reservations, and try to help advise the State Arts Council special program in ways that it can more effectively fund Native American projects in the arts.
Have you instituted any programs in that way?
Well, I mean, my main effort, I think, has been at the Cultural Council of American Indian Community House, where we are the founding members of that particular organization and of that particular wing of the organization, the cultural part of it. And so that was sort of breaking ground. But also, everywhere that I have gone in New York, all the projects are very new and require, I guess, a kind of attitude that is not very accessible in New York. I mean, you have to judge Indians by their own standards and in terms of what's going on in Santa Fe and what's going on in the northeast and northwest and so on.
Then are you saying that Anglo viewers should look at Indian art and assign to it a standard other than they do to Western art?
I think that eventually that's true of all art, isn't it? Don't you have to look at abstract expressionist painting much differently from the way you look at impressionist painting? Isn't really finally what art really is?
But quality in the end is the standard.
Right.
I think, in fact, it's one of the things that you touched on before, and that was that until recently, and I think there is, however imperceptible it is to you, may I?
Sure, of course.
A slight shift in emphasis
Right.
in terms of Indian art. I think that, I guess African art, up until the last 30 years, was viewed on an ethnological rather than an aesthetic basis. That has been a very dramatic shift.
Right.
And I begin to see the same thing occurring
It is.
with Native
It
American art. You have brought to us several examples of traditional art,
That's
the
right.
roots of painting.
The antecedents of painting, yes.
And
Yeah.
perhaps we should begin by talking
sure.
about some of these things. I'm thinking of this splendid bowl from Acoma, New
Yes.
Mexico.
Right.
Can you tell us, besides being decorative, what the aesthetic
Well, it is not
basis?
decorative. In
Well,
fact, that's the first error, if you'll forgive me, because you see, the Western view would be that this is decorative. Many, when I was sent over by the New York Times to cover Sacred Circles, 2,000 years of American Indian art, when it was at the Hayward Gallery.
in London.
In London, right. I mentioned in the piece that I did that people kept saying, oh, it's so decorative, everything is so covered with design. But I indicated that it's not decorative, at least not in the sense that roses are used to cover a teacup, in my opinion, to disguise the fact that it is, in fact, a teacup. But in this case,
Well, what is that surface? Tell us.
These surfaces are imprinted on this particular vessel, and give it a significance, an identity, no less clear than the identity of a fox or of a tree or of a person. This pot is a being, and in the Carlos Castaneda sense, it's filled with a power, a kind of aesthetic power. You see, in the Indian world, the aesthetic ideal is pervasive. It isn't a kind of aristocratic overlay. It isn't something that is done in spare time. It isn't something that one must acquire knowledge about in terms of a special elite or have particular abundant funds available in order to participate in it. It's a pervasive thing that any traditional Indian could look at this pot and say, give some value, say, oh well,
a good pot or a bad pot.
It's a good pot. It's not. It's a bad pot, or it's, you know. In fact, in my language, there's no word for art, but there are 11 words for shades of yellow. We are an aesthetic people. We're a people like all primal people whose first principle is not beauty but expression. You know. So this pot has expressive power, and it's not decorative. Now, I don't mean to suggest, as many people did for years, that everything about Indian art is symbolical.
With its own
because,
iconography.
of course, the iconography is much more ambiguous than that.
Can you tell us something about the pot that you're holding?
It's made in Acoma. Pottery is essentially made by women and decorated by women as a traditional idea, although this is not as adamant as it was in the past. There is no better or worse connected with this sexual division of labor. It's simply tradition. Women essentially always work in abstract geometric forms, and men work more often in pictorial forms, in narrative forms. This pot from Acoma and this basket from, this papago basket from southern Arizona, And the Papago and Pima are probably, other than the California tribes, the masters of basketry.
Is this around Tucson?
And this is south of Tucson. That's right, but it's that area. And if you see, the geometric ideas are similar. And though you can always find rain motifs and cloud motifs in these sedentary agricultural people for whom these elements of nature were tremendously important, what I'm really trying to say is that what is on the surface of these objects is as specifically part of their character and being as is our nose or our mouths or our eyes, which we couldn't call decorative. And I'm not saying that they are functional. I am simply saying they are identifiable part of the being of these objects.
In which medium do you think Indian art is most expressive? You brought us pottery, basketry, and beadwork.
I think they're expressive in all of these forms. Barbaralee, I think that all of them, like the media and Western art, all of them are able to fulfill a different they are able to support a different expressive content, but all of them have different points of view. This, by the way, is the way so-called beadwork started out in the Americas. This is is porcupine quill. They're the quills of porcupines, which are boiled and soaked, and then colored, split, and sewn onto sinew. Later, the Czechoslovakians introduced beads to the Americas, obviously sometime after Columbus.
Yes.
Right? And these glass beads became very popular, and you'll see in the early transition, you'll see, for instance, at the Museum of the American Indian at 155th Street and Broadway, you'll see pipe bags in which this quill work is still used, but beadwork is also used on it. And then gradually, the beadwork begins to take over more and more and more, and then you'll see the French influence of floral patterns begin to arrive, where really you can possibly call that work perhaps more decorative in a way, because...
Well, it's my assumption that this beadwork is older than the beadwork that you are holding.
That's right, yes. Right.
And I have determined that not because I know anything about Indian art, and I do not, but because of the color of the beads.
That's right.
And I might also say that I find this one more pleasing in color than the one you're holding, which leads me to a question that obviously concerns you, as it does, many others, and that is there, now that there is a wider acceptance of Indian art and Indian artifacts, there is, of course, always the danger of commercialism.
Yes, for all artists.
Yes, of course.
For
So on
Picasso,
the one hand, that the very thing that you would like to achieve, a wider audience for your work, sometimes serves to dilute that work.
It's true.
How dangerous is this whole aura, and how much of an incursion has commercialism made with Indian art?
Well,
objects?
a great deal. I mean, it's the same problem, though, for all artists. Here, I don't think there's any racial difference. The only difference is that everybody assumes that Indians are born, come out of the womb making pottery, and that we know everything about being Indian the moment we're born. And of course, that's crazy. And people assume that if you're Indian, you therefore are an authority on things Indian, and that's not true either. So many people feel that if you have an Indian, or a person who looks Indian, at the side of the road holding up some sort of trinket, that obviously this is the real thing, and it isn't the real thing, necessarily. It could be. Today, more and more of the really great craftsmen and artists and there's really no difference in the Indian world between the craftsmen and artists, but are really working out of studios, and their works, obviously, you pay for their greatness, right?
Whereas but to what extent are their works affected by Western culture and Western demands?
The great artists, some of them I can see moments of decline in them. I like to talk about the painters because I keep up with their work much more constantly. And in some of the painters, I begin to see in things like American Indian Arts Magazine or Arts in America and these publications, I begin to see in the ads I'm talking about a definite decline, especially in this churning out of lithographs for middle-class mantelpieces. But that you find everywhere. Non-Indians are doing the same thing. These limited editions are reaching the point where they are making art accessible to everybody, but I have the feeling often that the art that is finally arriving in the homes are somehow a compromise,
Well, you've said in the past that too much or too little is made about Indians,
yes.
of Indians.
Yes.
Can the same thing be said of their art?
Yes, yes, of course. I think that it's very important for us to just recognize its distinctions and what it is, but at the same time recognize that it has its failings and it has its amateurs and it has its rip-off artists like everybody else does.
Can you tell us about this Kiowa
Sure.
figure?
There were a number of young men in Oklahoma, they're Kiowa, who began to paint. And Stephen Mapope, who did this work, is one of them. This is a reproduction, by the way, not an original. But they were done on illustration board generally, or on paper, colored paper in the Southwest, and they are essentially watercolor work. They were self-taught in their own tradition, in other words. But this idea sprang out of a long history. It's related to some of these other things. But
Maybe
it
you'll
really
show us some pictures.
comes out of, let me show you what it comes out of. It comes out of the work of some artists. About 72 young Indians were required to go to prison in Fort Marion, St. Augustine, Florida.
What is the date of that?
1875. And they spent 3 years in prison. And they invented what is called ledger art, and this is an example of it. This is a work of Zautum, one of the 72, and amazingly enough, a great many of them turned out to be marvelous artists, but there's a long tradition of it, as I said. Indians had been painting their history on skins and
For
on
2,000
pottery.
years.
Yes,
What
for
are
many,
the
many
earliest
years.
known examples?
Well, most of them, because the materials are very perishable, are post-Christian, in other words, in the Christian era, so to speak. But the rock art and some of the early Kiva murals extend even further back. When these young men came home to Oklahoma, people realized that, gee, they had sold these ledger books that they had done with crayons. They're called ledger books because they were done in ledger books. They were given commissary books and ledger books, much as you would give them to children, because Indians were always considered sort of children's and wards of the state at that time, either marvelous savages or noble savages, one of the two. But what they filled these books with was something that was not childish art at all. It turned out to be nostalgic art. It turned out to be an expression of their great sorrow in being taken away from their people. And so when they went back, you see, to Oklahoma and to that area, other artists who are much younger said, gee, there are, or not artists, but young men said, gee, people will buy our work, people will pay attention to us. So the Kiowa Five, or the Kiowa Boys as they're called, and actually there was a girl among them, Louise Smokey, were given the right, through the efforts of Oscar Jacobson, the head of the art department at the University of Oklahoma at that time. It's about, I guess in about 1918, 1920, somewhere. I may be off a few years. Where they were given permission to become special students there, mainly to be able to experiment with materials and to try to find their own way. They were not terribly influenced by Western ideas and so on. And
Is Western
yes.
civilization so remote from tribal society? Are we really so different?
Yes. In fact, I give great emphasis to this. We're living in a day and age where there's great emphasis on how similar we are. And I think it's a drastic mistake. I think we're similar in very few ways. And the world that's described by biologists and physicists, those fundamental ways, cellular ways in which we are the same, are so few that I think we learn much more by dealing with our differences by our similarities. It's a very unfashionable viewpoint. But I think people like to overlook the fact that races and national groups do form stereotypes and generally do have temperamental differences. And I think these enrich us. And I think that we should emphasize those things rather than be so self-conscious about them. I don't think you have to be the same in order to be equal, and I think somehow equality and uniformity have been confused. I don't think democracy belongs in biology or in the arts. I think it belongs in politics, and God knows it isn't there. It isn't, in the Indian world, is not found there very often.
We were talking about the merits of some of these works aesthetically. If there is such a difference, can Anglos really comprehend, understand, appreciate the art of the Native American?
Sure, why not? I mean, first of all, it can be judged by Western standards, just as Japanese art and Japanese
But some
poetry.
Japanese think it is impossible, and the risk, and forgive me, I do not mean
Yes,
to be impudent,
yes.
but in one of the things that you have written, I think you said once, in fact you implied,
Yeah.
that it's almost impossible for a non-Indian to really understand Indian painting. But you've also said
Yes.
that even most Indians don't understand their painting tradition.
Yes, well,
So if neither Anglos
right.
nor Indians understand it,
I think
who does understand
right.
it?
I think you've misunderstood that a bit.
Well, then perhaps you might clarify.
Right, because what I said is that fundamentally it is as difficult for non-Indians to understand the Indian world as it is for men to understand women, or the experience of being women, or for non-blacks to understand the experience of being black. I think we've reached a time where we want to know what women think about being women, and what blacks think about being blacks, and I think it's high time we find out what Indians think about being Indian. And this goes beyond these races. Obviously, I cannot write a book like Saul Bellow or Philip Roth. The Jewish experience is also something that I can only grasp as an outsider, but that doesn't mean that I can't grasp it on some level. On the other hand, Indians in their own culture, as I said, are very, you know, and they would say, that's a pretty good pottery, and it's only pretty good. It's not a great one.
How do you
but
use...
let me finish, if I may. On the other hand, when they go into Anglo culture, then they are existing in a highly stratified culture where the intellect is stratified from relative naivete to a high degree of sophistication. So that in Acoma Pueblo you will see a beautiful old pot filled with plastic flowers. This is simply to say that the Indian may not, when he finds his way into Anglo society, may find his way into the world of the blue-collar worker or the white-collar worker. So Indian painting is largely, when you deal with the most contemporary example of Indian painting, like the work of, say, Fritz Scholder, who's probably, or the late Yeffie Kimball, a very great
Fritz
painter.
Scholder
The
is
Fritz Scholder is
the
here.
red ground, yes.
And Yeffie Kimball, who just passed away just recently, and I certainly lament her passing. When you deal with these two artists, you're dealing with something which is highly influenced by Western ideas. And many Indians, therefore, think of Fritz Scholder's work as being grotesque and so on. But one doesn't go to every Spanish farmer or politician or engineer to evaluate the work of Picasso. Exactly. To them, it may be grotesque.
How do museums, however, treat Indian art?
Well,
and how many museums?
There are a great many museums that in Song from the Earth I list a number of them that do have good collections. The Philbrook in Tulsa has one of the best. The Southwest Museum in Los Angeles has a very good one.
Please don't forget our Museum of the American Indian in New York City.
Of course, and the Museum of the American Indian.
Remarkable international collection.
Oh, it's great. And in fact, it's the greatest collection of Indian artifacts and painting anywhere. It's the largest also, supposedly. So and people, there are dealers here in New York that represent Scholder, and again, we lost a very great young painter at 32, was killed in an automobile accident recently, T.C. Cannon, whom I greatly admire. And so, if you see the point I was making, there are two worlds in America. It's one land, but two worlds. And Indians find the access to one as difficult as non-Indians find the access to the other. We live between worlds, and the great adventure, of course, is trying to pass between them.
Well, for helping us to bridge that gap, special thanks to you, Jamake Highwater. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein, and thank you, audience, for being with us, too.